Alright, this should be live from the beach, so as promised. Made it down to the beach here. Last time, still trying to wrap my head around what was done exactly, but I think I was trying to prep for getting out the door. I was trying to get hard drive synchronized, um, so that I always try to have backups of data in multiple places, and I'm pretty sure in the configuration I went with, I do a mix of both hard drives and also using cloud storage. So now that that's all done, I've kind of been easing myself back into some development, and um, whatever we're looking at here is not relevant to today. But if I had to open up another diagram, so in this diagram of uh, microservice hosting, there's this software called PM2, which is mostly going to be the topic of today's work. So PM2 could be thought of as kind of like a poor man's Kubernetes, but not really. I mean, people use it. I don't know. I do know from uh, going to different JavaScript conferences that people in the land of JavaScript do seem to use it. I don't know to what extent enterprises are using Kubernetes, or sorry, PM2 to manage, popular websites and web apps and what have you. Um, so basically, the and I don't think I have this really documented anywhere, but the desired behavior would be that um, a microservice could specify, maybe in its package JSON, or in the case of the code, um, I kind of have this install script that's been started. So basically, if you want to, just like you would with any kind of Linux-based daemon service, um, which it's kind of been interesting that the extent to which people use things like cron, or I don't know, we could go look up what Mac uses. Windows, I think it's like a service, and then on Mac, hold on, Ubuntu, I think it's unleashing your demons, creating services. So for anyone watching that does not know what a daemon is, it basically is just like or a Windows service. It basically makes sure um, that whatever command you tell it to execute will always execute on startup generally. But I'm just trying to figure out what the system control, yeah, is what it's called on Ubuntu, and then on Mac. Uh, Launch T is what it's called on Mac, and then in Windows it's called like a service. So the target of these deployments is always going to be, I'm just going to be running Ubuntu in production, but uh, the PM2 software kind of does the same, as having the system control, but PM2 you can think of as like, since it's abstracted, and runs across operating systems, you don't have to deal with these underlying operating system specific things. So if you go to PM2 site and check that out, um, yeah, they advertise it as process manager. And then other popular ones in the Node ecosystem would be like NodeMon, or like Node Daemon, but I mostly hear people say it as NodeMon. And what else they have? Yeah, there's the system D. Um, Nodefly, live reload. Forever is the other one. So we could go look that up, npm forever. And generally, I think that the forever library as well as nodemon, yeah, they reference those. Those would be like the three big ones. PM2 is considered the heaviest. Um, and people tend to consider nodemon would not be something that you'd use in like production. Hey, brah. um, have the resident bikini man coming in and out of the frame today, and um, so yeah, so basically what I've done is I've wrapped PM2, and as with all things that are abstract problems to be solved, where I've kind of gotten to is you kind of want the wrapper to be there at first, and then you kind of work backwards toward having an interface that makes sense to it. And so basically the commands that anyone would ever run at runtime, you have the install command, and that I think is going to need to install like the path of where and the path and the command to start a service into some kind of central location. So that could be a database, or I think it makes the most sense to use just a file system based cache. Um, so that's kind of what this script would do. Uninstall, which I don't think is here yet, or undemonize probably is going to be turned to uninstall. And then just for convention, having that space D as a prefix, signals that you're doing something in like a that's going to talk to the demonization. Um, and then this description is no longer accurate. So that's that. And the idea being that you can access PM2 and see that this like test server is online. Um, let's see if I run micro list. I don't know, to what extent stuff is or is not working just yet. So probably here I would do just a dump of have kind of a lookup object. Um, so we can check out what that does. But a lot of this code is kind of like I haven't touched this in 6 months. And I guess it's worth noting that sometimes when you're working on an abstract problem, like I've leading up to shooting this live video, like kind of putzed around with um, just writing code that maybe isn't actually needed to solve the problem. So sometimes I think it's completely normal that you're writing code at first that is not fully needed to solve um, whatever problem that you're working on, and then you kind of work backwards. And you're like, oh, okay, this is what I need to actually be solving for. Um, and so here, we can just code this list command right now. I think the thing that one would want or expect out of it is it's okay and nice that this exists, but there's a lot more information here. So probably you'd want the name of it, but then you'd want to know how to actually like access the site for it. So in this case, that information is stuck in, and I think there's an earlier video, I don't recall what episode, but we can go check it out. So if I go, maybe it's right here, ngrok service cache. So like episode 3 and episode 2 talk about the server cache. So that works. So this builds on that server cache work, which is kind of what's represented right here. And the idea being that you have the port information for every time you start up a server. talked about in that earlier episode, the cheap way to do this if you're like building a startup as a CTO, or you're just opting to not use like Kubernetes, is you'd have like some static map of this, what service maps to um, what port. But the way that this has been kind of constructed, because the objective here is to like kind of create a microservice hosting service, is that it kind of dynamically grabs these ports, and so it's important to store what services where. So I think that probably the desired, thing to have, and it's interesting to see. Cool. I did add this is daemon to the cache as well. So I think it would probably be something like this. So but what's kind of really a bit frustrating, I guess, right now is I got to stick some information. This key, you just wouldn't be able to look it up. And that's where the port information is. And I don't think for some reason I'm sticking it on here. Otherwise, it has the CWD, which is great. But if I go demonize procs, let's try that. So yeah, I just don't think it's sticking the correct, or there's information that should go um, onto these objects. So if I go to start node process, is kind of what runs the service in PM2. Um, if I go down, so it's probably, I go to the start function. I go sync from PM2. So it seems like to me that, so this is the function that the sync from PM2 is basically saying, go talk to the PM2 service, try to pull out information from it, and then stick it into the object we're trying to grab data from. And that is probably not something, there's some assumption in there that's just not correct. Scribe. So the way that this is stored, and this is unfortunately like one of the more confusing, sections of code, which I think I've kind of mentioned in other live streams, that there's a benefit to not only showing other developers um, what some of the harder problems are to solve, but um, it's also helpful when you also like live stream something like this, because it has the same function as pair coding, where once you talk through something, and this goes for any kind of learning-based subject, once you're talking through it, you're oftentimes going to be far more effective at it. So the return cache on this winds up having an object. We could go to it and see what it looks like. So it has both the, and guess I'm a little bit surprised where um, that if this was actually run from here, but we could check that. So this is kind of building on some knowledge from those prior videos, but if we go to the health check, I guess it does say it's in the CWD. Um, so okay, but yeah, when this gets stored in the cache, it's storing it under the PID, and so I think the idea there is that there are edge cases, notably in something called blue-green deployments, where you would have more than one PID for a microservice path at the same time. And a blue-green deployment is, we can look that up. Um, there's like a couple different deployment strategies if you're ever in like something like AWS and you have, I think they have that in their like application load balancers. You have like canary deployments, you have like geolocation-based deployments, you have I think like fixed percentage-based deployments and so on. But a blue-green is basically um, here you have, I don't know if I'm finding a good diagram just yet. Here's like, yeah, so if you just have a new release like this V2, that's your green environment. Um, the users see the blue environment, which is like, let's say, the old environment, and only once the green environment has proven to be like stable, it's online, it's tested, then you would tear down the old service. So that's the example of how you'd have two of the same microservices up, but then you would kind of seamlessly just route traffic to that new microservice, but only once it's online and tested, um, and uh, and proving to be stable. So going back to this, there's an assumption here that it just probably needs to be doing some additional work. I think another assumption just in architecting this is thinking. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think the architecture decision has to kind of account for that use case, which is like it's a little abstract to anticipate, and I think that you can get into a risk of over-engineering stuff when it comes into solving for stuff like this. But um, I think in general, like the right architecture here is that we'd probably iterate through that object, and just like currently it has is daemon set to true. Um, if there was the blue-green deployment, it would have some kind of like flag set that marks it as is blue-green, and then we're trying to solve for that issue of having a way to look up port information for a named daemon service. So there's a couple of things we're going to do here. We're going to do PID. So if it's not a daemon service, continue. Um, and then probably something like this. So if we'll do it's probably worth checking where this actually is even coming from. So this is getting from the server cache, but then here, this is each of those DM2 or PM2 services, which So I guess it will start off by doing the process by name. So it's important, again, just to like avoid the risk of over-engineering stuff. To go back, read the code that's going on, so you're not just like, this is unfortunately a pretty long function point. I would say I try to keep everything definitely under 200 lines. This is 181 to 268, so it's, even over 100 lines is a little bit suspect. But yeah, it's important to just read what's going on before you start anticipating a use case. And I think, like I said, it's sometimes with an abstract stuff, you'll just piddle around, solving stuff you don't need to at first until you get your clarity and focus on it. Which is also why I think I've in other live streams talked about making sure code is tested, because I've written code that worked, but then as soon as I started to try to integrate stuff on top of it, if it didn't have tests, I had to go back in and fix stuff. If it was 6 months had passed, I didn't know what the hell I had done, and you wind up just rewriting code that way. So you always want to make sure stuff is commented, and then this is obviously not at the point of testing, but you need that too, I think, so that it's you're fully completing whatever you're working on and not just getting it to a basic working state. So probably that assumption of having a flag of like is daemon or having like is blue green, like basically, whereas yes, like the server cache will store it that way, and that's totally fine, at least the way that it would be read from PM2, which is what this function is doing, that entire process, because I'm not sure that PM2 allows you to install or run. You can run PM2 as what's called mirror mode. PM2 mirror mode. Um, Maybe let's see. Cluster mode is what they call it. And I've done it. It's a pain in the ass. And that's where you have, I suppose, more than one process. But in general, like sometimes with tools like this, you want to, if you're integrating on top of something that's already built, you want to use sometimes not the full functionality. You want kind of to use just the core functionality that's there. So, they do have this like cluster mode, which is like handy because, and I'm probably not going to even dig into it, but because basically I'm more or less just saying that running Node.js processes as a cluster is a clusterfuck, because you, and I somehow forget like the exact um, terminology, but you're basically doing like piped process data sharing. You have to like then synchronize data between each one of those processes, and the benefit that you obviously get out of it in cluster mode, if you look it up, is that like a Node.js will bind to the same port, and then it will allow you to run a process on each one of the cores of your processor. Um, so distribute workloads among application threads. So it's like kind of in the realm of threading, but at the point that you're deploying microservices, you really ought to, unless you have a very processor intensive microservice, like you just, I have found that trying to support running microservices in a cluster mode is just diminishing returns. It's better to have like a sane environment where you don't have to deal with data synchronization. And I think if you look at like modern serverless and Lambda, um, you could kind of consider that. So if you look up serverless architectures and you look up maybe data persistence, I probably spelled persistence wrong. So they'll tell you that they don't persist data. And so that's how you get around, that's how they get around that constraint of data synchronization, is that every time you run the Lambda, you should have the expectation that there's no persistence. That if you want persistence, you should have a third-party service or process like a database or like an object store for any kind of persistence. So, um, so yeah, I mean, they're maybe effectively doing something similar with serverless where they have any process is run on a load balanced type of setting, clusters in Node.js. That API could be thought of as something similar. It all comes down to like threading. So it doesn't matter. There's multiple strategies of threading. Um, but this is kind of dealing with threading on the actual processor, and then going back to PM2, it has that, but yeah, that's why in general, like you can run a process, um, a same named process, um, but yeah, I think in the case of like if it's a blue green, generally speaking, that then goes back to the architecture at work here would be um, that if you run a service, um, you're going to just replace that service. That's the user interface that will be created. I have something already pretty similar in the server class where there's a mirror mode, but if you're not running as a mirror mode and the server's already up for that path, it just will do nothing. All right, so going back to this. So I think here it could be a safe assumption that whereas there could be like a mirrored local process, um, for now, I guess it's okay to make an assumption, and these types of things are worth commenting on. So yeah, comments like this help because, if you come back at a later time and you try to, and something's not working, having this kind of documentation helps you identify that. All right, so this here. So now this becomes this. And then right there, I think. So interesting little note. It's doing the red squiggly lines because I have an ESLint rule that says the columns can't exceed 80 characters, and that was something that I had picked up at Google, where they have kind of a insane level of code quality standards that they adhere to, and the reason I think for the 80 character column limit is that if you ever go onto a site like GitHub and you look at code there, you know, it's spaced out to about 80 characters. And then also if you tilt a monitor to be vertically rotated, which of course allows the most space to see what code is on your screen, that 80 characters happens to be, the exact amount that allows you to have a file browser open and see the code. So there's little nuances sometimes with tools and decisions that developers make that just aren't obvious at first. Um, but you know, it, if someone that's been doing it a while says like, this is the way that things are done, there's oftentimes these unseen reasons for it. Um, and I think like at a company that large, like they probably even have uh, people that have like PhDs and I don't know, like human psychology and ability to like read lines of anything and having, the exact amount of characters per line is something that's been studied probably, for what's efficient for people to read. Okay, so now this is here. So if we did this command again, this micro d list, it should now produce the information in a way that's more digestible. Unless I messed that up. Okay. This list command. So this should be, let's do micro d. So behind me today, I'll just open this up, is um, the bay where people, it's like the kite surfing capital of the lower Baja Peninsula. So you can already tell the wind on the microphone. It's probably been persistent throughout. It's already kind of picked up. But okay, so now it's not stored on like a PID, but it's just stored on a fixed key called server cache. So, all right, that's going to now be doable to do something like this. So it'd be here. And when I I'm just building a new service, I always aim for functionality out of any kind of console printing, and then over time I figure out a way to make things prettier. I don't, you know, it's I just want like the basic information. So this command should just tell you like what's the service name, what port is it located on. And so here we do here. And then don't need that. So normally, if you ever try to do a console log like this, it would probably just crap out on you. But um, the microhost product underlying all of this has a wrapper that will just interpret any object that you try to print. And well, I think what it'll do instead is it'll run native .toString on it, and you'll just get something that looks like an object print, which is not really doing much for anybody. So I have kind of a wrapper on top of console in the microhost product that will just stringify it nicely. So okay, like this is fine. Um, this allows a lookup now, so that if you have the idea is that with a daemonized service, and if we go back to like the end objective here is um, to have the ability to what you want out of any orchestration technology is just the ability to bring your entire ecosystem up with one command and then reliably know that if the service has some unforeseen error, that the orchestration technology will try to reboot it a handful of times. Obviously you're trying to in any orchestration technology cover all of that with unit tests and then integration tests. but there's always going to be some weird unforeseen edge cases that hopefully only happen, 1 in 10,000 requests, I guess, for instance. You want like a low incidence of error, but then you also want, an orchestration technology behind the scene to just reboot. Obviously, what an orchestration technology does is it will notify you as the person managing that service that it crapped out. Like, you should definitely by all means go check out what happened so it's not doing that. um, but that's how you get to like those 5 nines of uptime, which is kind of like generally a standard in production reliability. But the other component that's like developer usability component is that you want your ecosystem to be brought online in one command, and then one of the very first things you'll want to do, even if your services know like where all how to find each other, because that's something that's been I covered in like an earlier live stream episode. You sometimes are going to want to, as a developer, know where they're brought online at. And I don't exactly know that this is going to be, the end all be all. I don't know if there's a server equivalent command that I have for this. So if we went to here and we do micro server list, this could just do like a cache printout. I just don't know. So in other words, you'll probably, like when you're running this tool, you'd have a mix of, oh, it does a table, that's nice. You'd have a mix of like demonized services and services that you're just running. So I guess it's just like doing console.table right here. Um, but I don't know, maybe I'd go in and fix that. Let's see where we're at on time. It's about 40 minutes in. Um, so yeah, I mean, I might go back in and like tweak this a little bit so it's a similar level of readability, because I sometimes think, even though it's always nice to have like a table readout, when you use the native console.table for JavaScript, it's just not very readable. Um, but okay, so I'm okay sometimes, like if just having like a basic, functionality of something like this micro D list, like it works. Um, that's cool. So then another issue that I found was I started to try to write a cache, but I incorrectly, like going back to that remark that sometimes you're just going to piddle with abstract problems before you have to look at it long enough, and then you'll gain a focus of what you do and don't need to do. Um, and so for that, like, I don't really think, because there's this ability to just talk to the PM2 service and do um, I know there was some ping, but I don't know what the heck that ping was about. Maybe that's in the YouTube. I'm still learning all of YouTube's live stream stuff, but I don't think there's anything going on. Um, but and by the way, it's probably worth noting that this live stream is run on a Starlink, which is, I think we were out at dinner the other night and someone said the words before I could, which is it's just such a game changer. That's the only reason I'm able to work here. There's maybe an LTE reception, but it's not good enough for any kind of live streaming. So that's totally nuts. That's totally separate tangential topic of, I just say, I'm like, I don't know why everybody hates Elon Musk. He's just like a programmer who happens to be CEO of a bunch of companies, and I don't really view him as egotistical as much as I just think he's like maybe on the spectrum. And I don't see any problem with that. I mean, he's, granted my life the ability to just work from the beach, so hell yeah, that's what I think. So, okay. so as I started to basically author, so okay, yeah, it's basically like this PM2 list function. Again, you can run that. You can see, what PM2 is running at any given moment. And I think that the work that was done in the just a few episodes ago of server cache, um, that handles most of what is needed in terms of like storing stuff in the file system. So I started to over-engineer when I first got back into this, and I started to try to create a server cache storing all of this information. But the truth is that it's really not necessary. But what is necessary is that if you're trying to do the equivalent of like a system D or a launch D, um, that you want to have that mechanism to install the microservice. So um, that is kind of the objective here today. So get rid of that and then go online. Don't need this either. So I started to write um, so probably all of this is kind of unnecessary. So here's what I think. I think if we think about like in other words, PM2, let's see. Help. Serve. Deep update kill. I just want to make sure I'm not reinventing something that PM2 already provides. Um, log rotate startup. This is probably that's interesting, but the idea of having a thing like PM2 is you get portability out of it, and then your integration with the underlying operating system, demonization is thin, meaning you only have to demonize PM2, and then PM2 will demonize everything else. Um, so what you kind of want is something that's like what I'm looking for is something that would say the equivalent of like here. That's probably something like this, but the reason, I mean, it's worth researching. So install or update a module and run it forever. That's great. That could be what's desired. Um, reload processes. Scale, stop, create, return PID. Um, I mean, it's really cool actually that they allow you to do a Git path as well. That means that it's probably going to download it from some remote, um, which, it's kind of funny because I have some of the tools, or uninstall module, and uninstall module. Thinking about this. It's worth looking up. PM2 install. So this is like how to install PM2, but I think what's wanted is server and apps overview. Single page doc. Maybe that. Let's search for, we want the install command in particular, not how to install PM2. Could do it like this. Right here. Log size. Hmm. So yeah, the main reason I'm hesitant, and this again goes back to that idea of when you're integrating some other service, like you obviously take like the benefits of what they give you. So, PM2 providing the auto restart functionality, they provide logging. So I had started actually, by wrapping a library called Winston. I had started um, by you know wrapping that Node.js cluster um, API before deciding that it was just too much overhead for the benefit you get. And then once I looked at PM2, which I discovered, through a JavaScript conference, decided, you make careful decisions, I think, about what technology you bring in. But then even then, it's like PM2 ultimately, and even though I'm more than happy to try to kick some money their way if I, stage up something that people are paying for and look, toward a partnership angle, like ultimately, like they're trying to push services in one direction and they're not necessarily accounting for all use cases. It doesn't invalidate the usage of that tool. It just means you have to also, if you're designing and architecting software ecosystems, you have to just curate what part of a technology you're using. I think in this case, um, whereas they might have an ability to just install and run a service forever, I probably, there's again, there's that use case of, like I mentioned a little earlier, where I have this mirror mode, where if you want to, you can mirror a server. But the problem with that is that if you're kind of, as explained by wherever this diagram is here, probably right here. So in other words, if you have a gateway that's pathing out requests to a named service, um, you have to resolve, which service does that go to, which of course that's helpful when it comes to, I don't know if I have that blue-green deployment. It's helpful when you have a blue-green deployment because that's how you kind of seamlessly update your services. But the other use case is that if you're a developer, you have to think about this. If you're a developer and you want to do an actively change locally, the use case I want is that if you create a server locally for a service, you preempt the daemon. So it'd have to then stop the daemon and tricky. Let's see. Oops. In other words, the less code that you write, the is a Docker container safe module options versus PM2 start, because this is the one that already I've wrapped. Debug purpose. Let me go back and check what the code is actually doing. So there's the start. So this, I think, yeah, that's all it's running is just start. But what does the options object look like? So it has a name, it has the CWD. Here, and then it's worth going to, they have an API page. API, thought. Maybe this one. Nope. Server and apps, quick start, documentation, quick start, enterprise, runtime. Could be here. So I think this is like the script, but I don't know where. Maybe it's like a Node.js API that I'm looking for. This one, JavaScript API. Here. Maybe we go check out that install, but they don't have that on this page. So I think that install, it's also a newer API, and then I just don't, I know this start function has been around forever. And then this is probably what the options. This is probably what I've been using, but this is how you specify like a new PM2 service. So that's another reason to be hesitant to try to like just out the gates integrate with everything that a software offers, because a lot of the time, even though it's enticing to think that they provide an auto start capability. So in other words, they clearly do seem to have a way that hooks in now, which is great with all of the operating systems. So that looked like, what was it, Ubuntu, if we search for that. Right here, the init system. So this is great. This is amazing. I love this. I wonder if they have Windows. They don't have Windows. I guess I don't care. um, Pup found a seagull. Uh, so they clearly have this, which simplifies. You don't even have to integrate. They've already integrated for it. But then there's nothing really that's clear about the docs that as soon as you start PM2 for the first time, that it's going to bring your services online. And so it's kind of like, and who knows like what this team is doing like with most of their time. So I think you have to make some pretty careful choices a lot about what you go trying to integrate with. And then the other thing probably to like check for would be like auto. Just for, like look for the word auto in here. But I think my gut take says that with PM2, what you're really getting is like as soon as you signal a service to start in PM2, um, that thing will be restarted, and that's the main benefit of orchestration technology. So restart a service and file change, that's cool, but restart delay, no auto restart. And again, we're seeing stuff that indicates that auto restart, which again is like the main use. But there's nothing that says like when you first, we could try startup. We don't really need a bash script to run on start. I mean, that could be useful, but again, I think because of that portability aspect, and bash would run in theory on whatever operating system, but this is not quite the use case we're looking for. Integrate PM2. So yeah, I think that's kind of persistent applications. But yeah, no, now we've looped through the list of stuff. So yeah, I think that it's always important. Like you could, this is kind of when people talk about you know, you I had a colleague who one time told me that, he had a colleague on his team, oops, that would Leroy Jenkins a code base, meaning that like, you really don't want to be in the business of like running into a code base and just coding as quickly as possible. You want to carefully research what you're doing. Um, and here, let me try to get the view behind me, make it bigger because it's pretty gorgeous. It's just blue-green water. I'm very happy for being able to work like this. And yeah, I think since this is about an hour, I'm probably gonna stop it there. But I guess in general today, like the work was like literally just reading PM2's docs. I prior to live streaming, determined that I was over engineering, trying to build a cache like was done in I think episode 2 and 3. When really all that's needed to store persistently is like what microservices are you trying to start every time you first start PM2, and then looking through docs on PM2 about whether or not, and even though they do have a command that looks like it could fulfill that, just making sure that they haven't satisfactorily done that yet. So, because they haven't, and that was the determination, it is the right problem to solve. You want to make sure you're solving the right problem and not just like trying to, I think the phrasing is like, um, you see a nail and then you immediately go beat it with a hammer. So yeah, I'd say probably this will be the subject of the next live stream or two. Um, and yeah, we'll pick up where this left off, and then I might start to just shoot some other video content that, um, you know, talks about stuff that's not really live coding, but just kind of blends the beach backdrops, talking about different topics in tech. All right, until next time. And yeah, I think as with before, it's like I don't anticipate, it might be like a year from now that someone watches this and then has some questions. I'll try to pay attention to notifications and then answer questions.